prayers that our learning should be as food for bringing home the hostages and protecting the soldiers and Am Yisrael and all of the innocents. Last time we went through this part of the Gemara that was trying to bring a proof for Rav Zvid. Rav Zvid, as you may recall, said that Kotevet Hagasa She'amru Chasra Me'Kebetza. This was a machlokus between Rav Zvid and Rabbah about the size of the Kotevet Hagasa. Is a Kotevet Hagasa bigger than a Kebetza or less than a Kebetza? So along the way, we theorized that maybe it's even the same as a Kebetza, but I'll just point out that there isn't an opinion, there's no opinion that it's the same as the Kebetza. It was just it was part of a theoretical construct that we went through along the way. But what we did is, first we talked about Rabbah, and then the last couple of weeks we've talked about Rav Zvid. And Rav Zvid, the Gemara wanted to bring a proof for Rav Zvid that the Kotevet Hagasa is less than a Kebetza. And the proof was from this Mishnah about Soor and Chametz. It was really based on the Shita of Beit Shammai. And also just to point out a couple of things. So what we learned is Beit Shammai said Soor b'gazayit Chametz b'kikotevet. And that what did that mean? Soor b'gazayit Chametz b'kikotevet. What was that referring to?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question again?
Beit Shammai says Soor b'gazayit Chametz b'kikotevet. So what does that mean? So
basically the one is chayav for a smaller amount, the kotevet of seor, and for a
what are they chayav for?
I believe it's actually karet, isn't it? No.
I'm not asking what the onesh is. I'm asking what's the aveira?
The aveira is possession of just having it in your house. Nachon?
Okay, so the aveira here is bal yirai bal yimatzeh. Not allowed to have possession of chametz in one's domain for Pesach. And so, yes, so Se'or b'kazayit, so it means that the chiyuv onesh, the chiyuv chatat, would be for somebody if they had a kazayit of Se'or or a kotevet.
Yes. Beyond the zayit and beyond the kotevet.
Right, in other words, that's the minimum. Less than that.
Minimum, yes.
Right, so less than those shiurim, you're not allowed to have, but you're not chayav chatat, right? So that's the shiur for onshin. So, so the Gemara wanted to bring a proof from Beit Shammai by saying Beit Shammai was learning as follows. They made the following learning construct where they said the Torah could have just told me that it's asur to have chametz, and then I would have figured out myself that you're not allowed to have soor. Because what would I have said? That chametz she'ein pimutzo kasher asur b'kazayit, soor she'pimutzo kasher lo kol shekain, right? I would make a kol shekain to say that if chametz is asur to own on Pesach, then certainly Se'or would be asur to own on Pesach. But since the Torah differentiated, in other words, it explicitly lists both chametz and Se'or, it must be to teach me something. So Beit Shammai says it's to teach me that they do not, that their shiur is not the same. Shiuro shel zeh lo kashiro shel zeh. And therefore, I'm going to assign the shiur of kazai to the soor and the kotevet to chametz. And we discussed why last week, why specifically it goes that way. Why doesn't it go the other way? Why don't you say chametz b'kazayit and soor b'kotevet? But we had right, so we saw the reasons for that. So that's the tashtit, that's the foundation. And so then the Gemara goes to the next step. So if you would think that Kotevet Hagasa, that they said, that Chazal said regarding Yom Kippur, is more than a kibetza, or in general, that Kotevet Hagasa is more than a kibetza, Mikde Beit Shammai Ashiur Dinafish Mikazaika Mahadre, in that Beit Shammai is just going after, they're trying to find a shiur that's greater than a kazayit. In other words, now we have soor and chametz. I know that they do not have the same shiur because the Torah went out of its way to mention both. And so now I have to assign a larger shiur to the soor. So why didn't, Beit Shammai could have just said that the larger shiur is kibetza. If all they're doing is looking for a larger shiur, they could have said a kibetza. And maybe you'll say, granted, they could have said kibetza, but they said kikotevet because it's the same shiur, and they just decided that they'll say kikotevet instead of kibetza. You know, it's like saying it's, it would be like saying ounces instead of grams, let's say. It's the same shiur, but you just call it something different. The Gemara also pushes that away and says, look, if they could have said kibetza, then they should have said kibetza, because that's the more widely used shiur, right? That's the one that's easier to use. So rather, it must be that when they were looking for a shiur that's larger than a kazayit, they chose kikotevet dafka because it's larger than a kazayit, but less than a
kibetza. It's in the middle somewhere.
So it's in the middle somewhere. So it has to be less than a kibetza. So that's the reasoning. And based on that, then I would say that would be a proof for Rav Zvi. So I also want to point out, it doesn't matter in this argument that we don't paskin like Beit Shammai. All we need to do is show that there's a reason why Beit Shammai chose kikotevet for one of the shiurim. So even though we don't paskin like Beit Shammai, but Beit Hillel's argument with Beit Shammai isn't that he chose kikotevet dafka. It's a fundamental disagreement about whether there's a different shiur for soor. So then the Gemara pushes away this proof, and the way they pushed away the proof, they said maybe Kotevet Hagasa Shamru Yiterami Kabetza. Maybe the Kotevet Hagasa that we say by Yom Kippur is in fact larger than a Kabetza, Hastama Kabetza. But Beit Shammai doesn't talk about Kotevet Hagasa. He only talks about Kotevet, Stam. Hastama Kabetza. That when Beit Shammai said Soor b'kikotevet, Soor b'kazayit chametz b'kikotevet, they don't say kikotevet hagasa, and it stands to reason that kotevet and kotevet hagasa are not the same shiur. So maybe kotevet hagasa, which is what we want to find out about, maybe that is in fact larger than a kibetza, and the kotevet stam is less than a kibetza. Or inami ki hadade ninu, or maybe it's true. So in other words, it's saying, granted, I'll accept this whole line of reasoning that the kotevet stam is less than a kibetza. But that doesn't answer our question, because our question is about kotevet hagasa. So we say kotevet hagasa, that could be that it's more than a kibetza. Or inami ki hadadinin, or maybe the kibetza and the kotevet hagasa are in fact the same shiur. V'chad minayu nakat, and Beit Shammai chose to say, kotevet instead of, or our Mishnah chose kotevet hagasa, and it could have said kibetza, but I don't have a proof now that kotevet hagasa is smaller than a kibetza. So the Gemara now wants to bring another proof, a different proof. So this is now where we're going to get into the sugya.
Michelle,
Yeah.
it is very strange that the rabbis don't remember this or know this, which
This is right.
Which midah is, which shiur is bigger and smaller than. You have to, when you write the text, there are a huge amount of things which you have to know to understand the text. But suddenly there are things which you don't remember, you don't know. This is very strange, because they lived at those times. Well, of course, it's the Mishnah, it's the Gemara, it's not at the same time, but nevertheless, it's not
okay, so
very far away.
You raise a very good point, and so let's talk about it for a moment. Let's just talk about this question for a moment. So the question is, how could it be that the Mishnah, that the Gemara was mamash mutal b'safek, like they really did not know what this shiur was. Or I should say they didn't know. Or I could say that in fact there were two different traditions. There's a slight difference between those two possibilities. So let's talk about this idea for a moment. Maybe there were two traditions, and one of them was that it's larger, one of them that it's smaller. Or another possibility, a similar but distinct possibility, is it goes back to this discussion we had a few weeks ago about when I showed you the Mishnah and Kelim that talked about where the Mishnah says the Kazayit Shamru was this Kazayit, and the Kibetza Shamru is this. And we saw there also there's an opinion that there's a certain amount of subjectivity to any shiur, and it might have to do with the size of the beitzim that you see and the size of the kazayitim that you see. However, what Paul is pointing to is that there's a more fundamental, possibly there's a more fundamental issue here, because here, I could have focused on the kotevet hagasa in that same way, and I could say it's like the kotavot from such and such a place, right? Because we saw similar arguments, and we saw similar ideas from the Mishnah. But instead, it's saying what we want to know is what's its size relative to the beitzah. What's the relative size? Is it larger? Is it smaller? So listen, there are actually, of course, many instances where the Gemara doesn't have a clear-cut interpretation, a clear-cut understanding of a Mishnah. That quite a lot of the Gemara, in fact, right, is analyzing Mishnayot to try to determine what Mishnayot mean. And you may remember I've talked about this in the shiur before, that there's a certain hierarchy of questions that the Gemara asks about any given Mishnah. And the first question that the Gemara will ask about a Mishnah is definition of terms. What do the words mean? Now, very often the Gemara never asks that question. When the Gemara doesn't ask that question, it means the Gemara
obvious.
knows. They already know that. So they're going on to the next level of questioning. But here, this is like a first level question, is to determine what is the Kotevet Hagasa. So yeah, there were different, there were either so look, what are the possibilities? One possibility is that there were two traditions, which means at some point, whatever the original understanding was lost. Or either, I shouldn't say lost, but the original understanding was, let's say, not passed down in a straightforward fashion. Another possibility is, I think, and we're going to see this more because as the sugya progresses, we're going to talk more about shiurim and how they're determined. So part of the answer to your question we may be able to derive from the next daf that we're going to get to, which is going to be maybe not today, but by next week, we're going to start.
This is a Talmud Bavli.
This is the Bavli, and there is
maybe in the Yerushalmi, maybe it's different because maybe they do know the shiur.
We'll look. Since you mentioned it, we will also look at the Yerushalmi, but not today. There's a short Yerushalmi here on this issue. But what else? But along those lines, there's I think in this particular case it has to do though with the nature of shiurim, which is again they're fixed in a way that they're fixed according to, on the one hand, there's like a tradition, there's some kind of tradition where where we're going to use these naturally occurring things like an olive or an egg or things like that. Or a barley corn, like we have different things that anybody should have access to in order to determine shiurim. So we have that, but on the other hand, those things themselves are not fixed. Those things themselves are not fixed. So the question, so to come back here to our sugya. So what you see, I mean, Paul raises a very good point that when we get to our Gemara that starts talking, we have this machloket between Rabbah and Rav Tzvi about the size of the Kotevet Hagasa. Is it larger than a kibetza or smaller than a kibetza? Notice that in the way the Gemara presents the issue, the Gemara is not trying to, or the Gemara is not at least ostensibly trying to fix the exact size of the Kotevet Hagasa, except relative to other shiurim. So whether I say it's bigger or smaller than a kibetza doesn't entirely answer a basic question, which is how big is it? Still doesn't tell me that. So what I'll understand though from this discussion is it's probably close to a kibetza, but I don't know if it's a little bigger or a little smaller. But more than that, I can't say. I think what we should do though is let's go on and let's keep this question in mind. I think it's a very relevant question, but as we see, we're gonna get into it as we go on. And in fact, today we're going to talk about it a little bit more. So let's keep that question in mind, and also, but bear in mind what I said at the beginning. that there are many mishnayot that are mutal b'safek in that regard. And this is one of the reasons that things did come to be written down, because the absolute aspect of certain halachot was being lost. And then there's certain things that even if you write them down, are not entirely helpful. So, like in Hilchot Nida, a woman who sees blood, there was an expertise that was lost, of determining whether she's Tameah or Tahora based on the particular shade of red that she saw. And the Gemara Nida says that it was Rabbi Elazar, who we mentioned already in the Sugya, who was a first generation Amorah, was essentially the last person who had that expertise. And that's an expertise that you can't write down. You have to you have to learn that from somebody. And distinguishing colors is a very tricky thing, right? Because it'll depend on your lighting, and it depends on other things. And there were other ways of determining blood. There were ways of taking a cloth that had the blood and washing it or putting it through essentially different kinds of chemical reactions to determine whether it was dam nida or not, right? So, but a lot of those things have been lost, and so nowadays we're very limited in terms of how we judge that. But also nowadays, the only reason that we need to know whether a woman is Tameah or Tahora is for having relations with her husband. In the time of the Beit HaMikdash, and even for a number of generations afterwards, people who ate their food b'tahara also had to know if a woman handled food, that she could be metameh the food depending on her status. And actually, we're going to talk in the next part of the sugya. We're going to talk about tumat okli. Anyway, so let's go on. So now the Gemara wants to bring another possible proof from this sugya in Masechet Brachot. So let's just read in the Gemara, in our Gemara, Elam he'acha. Rather from here, in other words, I'm going to try to prove Reb Zvid from this source, from here. Ad kama mizamnin. Literally, until how much do you make a mezuman? Until, as a minimum. In other words, what's the minimum amount that people have to eat in order that three of them together can make a mezuman for Birkat HaMazon? Ad kazayit, divrei Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir says ad kazayit in this context means at least a kazayit. They have to eat at least a kazayit. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ad kibetza. Rabbi Yehuda says they each have to eat a kibetza. So this is actually a braita, and the Mishnah there's a Mishnah that's almost the same, except in the Mishnah it leaves out divrei Rabbi Meir, right? We know from the braita that this daya is Rabbi Meir. So the Mai Kam Mifligi. So the Gemara asks, so what is their machloket? What are they arguing about? So Rabbi Meir Savar V'achalta Zu Achila V'Savata Zu Shtia. Right. So everybody knows the pasuk V'achalta V'Savata V'Erachta Hashem Elokecha Aharetz Hatova Asher Natan Lach. We all know that because it's actually in the Birkat HaMazon. And so Rabbi Meir, they're saying, why does he say a kazayit? Because he'll say v'achavta, and so wait, and also let's flesh this out a little bit. So the pasuk says v'achalta v'savato v'erachta. So what do we learn out from that pasuk? What's the basic thing we learn out from that pasuk?
If you
the-
eat,
Michael Schwartz.
yeah, if you eat a certain amount of, it doesn't say bread specifically, but if you eat a certain amount and you're satisfied, then you have to make a bracha afterwards.
Right. So this is the source for Birkat HaMazon from the Torah. This is one of only two brachot that we have to do that has a source from the Torah itself. It doesn't give us the nusach of the bracha, but we see that if you eat, you have to make a bracha afterwards. So, right, this is the way Chazal understood it. So v'achalta v'savato v'erachta. So the question is, what does each word mean? So Rabbi Meir says, achalta means that you eat, savata means that you drink. And so what does it mean? If you eat or if you drink, you have to say a blessing afterwards. And so then what do I say? V'achila b'kazayit. Stam achila is b'kazayit. And the Gemara is going to talk about that again a little bit further on in the sugya. But this is muskam. We're going to see in the next part of the sugya, there's a braita where Rebbe says that for all the shiurin of the Torah, that kazayit is the basic shiur. I'll just skip ahead for a second. It says Tanya Rebbe Omer, Kol hashiurin kulan b'kazayit, chutz mitumat ochlin. All of the shiurin, as Rashi says, morin ba'ochlin, that are talked about food, regarding food, they're all kazayit. So so this was muskam. So if you say v'achalta is achila, so it means achila is kazayit. So now birkat hazimun, right? Making a mezuman is based on the fact that you're going to say birkat hamazon. So we learn out making a mezuman from different psukim. There's a machloket about which psukim, but let's say one of them is Kishem Hashem Ekra Havu Godel Eloheinu. So there's an idea that if I say Hashem, then Havu, that two of you are going to reply with about the greatness of God. That's the idea of Mizunai. In any event, we may look at that also just to round this out. But for our purposes, this is what we want to say. Rabbi Meir is saying you have to eat a kazayit in order to be part of a mezuman. Why does he say a kazayit? Because he says the Torah says v'achalta. Achalta means you have to eat. And the minimum amount you have to eat in order to say a bracha afterwards is going to be a kazayit. Rabbi Yehuda savar v'achalta v'sabata achila sheyesh basviya. That the Torah here, it's not v'achalta like that you eat or you drink, which is how Rabbi Meir is learning it. V'achalta is achila, v'sabata is shtiya. So it means if you eat or if you drink, you have to say a blessing. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, v'achalta v'savata is one concept, it's one block. So the Torah is saying, if you ate enough to be satisfied, then you say a blessing. Ve'ezeh, so how much is achila sheyesh basviya? Zeh kebetza. That's a kibetza. So now, what is it that we want to prove? What's the Gemara going to want to prove from this machloket? Where did we start?
That a kotevet hagasa is less than a betza.
Excellent. So now we can make an argument that a kotevet hagasa must be less than a kibetza. Why? Isal kadatach kotevet hagasa shamru yiterami kibetza. if you would say that the Kotevet Agasa that they said regarding Yom Kippur is more than a kibetza, hashta kibetza svue misava. A kibetza is enough for you to be sated, to be satisfied. Data lo miyatvai, and it's not. It wouldn't that be enough to be miyashev da'at? Remember, what did we say on Yom Kippur? What did we say about Kotevet Agasa? That if you eat enough if you eat the equivalent of Kotevet Hagasa, that's miyashev da'at. It puts your mind at ease. So it stands to reason that Yishuv Hadat is a point that I will reach before I reach complete satisfaction
Satiety.
satiety. I was going to say, yeah, I always get before I reach satiety, right? So satiety would mean you're full, and we actually already discussed that as well in an earlier part of the sugya. That one of the ways that you're patur for eating on Yom Kippur is if you're completely sated, and then you eat more than that. So then that's patur on Yom Kippur, because that's no longer considered the kind of achilah that is for the purposes of Yom Kippur, because then you're suffering from eating. So satiety is a high bar. So if kibetza is enough to reach satiety, and Kotevet Hagasa is enough just to give you Yishuv Hadat, it stands to reason that that's less. Elalav Shma Mina Kotevet Hagasa she'amru pachot mikabetza. Stands to reason then that Kotevet Hagasa that they said is less than a kibetza. Kibetza misava. Kibetza is enough to give you satiety. Kotevet miyadvadate. The Kotevet is enough to give you Yishuv Hadat. So here, that's the end of this part of the sugya. So now we've proven Rav Zvid, right? This is a good proof for Rav Zvid, and so now we could answer the question that Paul asked, I think, 2 weeks ago. What's the halacha? So the halacha is going to be like Rav Zvid. Because the Gemara ends off being this way. The Gemara ends off with this conclusion. So good. So that's where we're up to. I was thinking of looking at the sugya further in Masechet Brachot, but I think we'll just go on. The Gemara in Masechet Brachot, just so you know, this is a truncated version of the sugya. There's more discussion about this in Brachot, but this is the part that's relevant to our discussion. So the Gemara skipped part of the discussion of the Mishnah. So I think for us, it's going to be enough. So I think what we'll do now is we're going to go on. We're going to read this, and we're going to have a little bit of a lesson in Tumat Ochlin, and in order to understand this. So Tanya, we learn in a Braita, Rebbe Omer, Kol HaShiurim Kulan B'Kazayit, Chutz Mitumat Ochlin, Sheshina HaKatuv B'Mashma'an, B'Shinu Chachamim B'Shiuran, V'Raya L'Davar, Yoma Kippurim. So this is the Braita. All of the shiurim of the Torah regarding Ochlim are kazayit, except for Tumat Ochlim. So what's Tumat Ochlim? So, yeah, do you want to say something? Go ahead.
I believe that's when you I believe that is food that's become impure by coming in contact with something impure.
Okay, so you might say that.
I might say that. It says,
Listen, here's the thing. It's basically true, but it's a little more complicated. So we're going to have a quick lesson in Tumat Ochlin. Some of this you might know, and maybe it'll just pull some things together. But what we're looking at here is the Rambam Hilchot Tumat Ochlin Perek Aleph. And actually, the Rambam here for Hilchot Tumat Ochlin, there's one mitzvah, right? So this is Hilchot Tumat Ochlin, mitzvah taseh achat, v'hidin Tumat Ochlin mashkin v'hechshira. So we're going to talk about the din of how food or drink can become tameh and their hechsher. So what we're going to learn is that in order for food to become tameh, it needs hechsher. In other words, it has to come in contact with one of 7 liquids in order for it to be mekabel tumah. And we'll see this in the Rambam, but you can imagine if let's say, think about fruit that's still on the tree. So anything that's mechubar the karka is not mikabel tumah. So what happens when you pick the fruit? Could it be mikabel tumah at that point? So then that's where we'll see you need hechsher. So let's see this in the Rambam. Says kol ochel hamiyuchad lemachal adam. Any kind of food that is particular for human consumption. Kigon lechem, basar, va'anavim, v'zeitim, v'chuyotzei bahen. Any of these kinds of food that people eat. But notice he says lemachal adam, right? Because that's an important point. But in other words, think about food that people eat. All of that food, mikabel tuma, it can become tameh. Because she'eno miyuchad lemachal adam, harei ze tahor, ve'eno mikabel tuma. Any kind of food that is not food that people eat is tahor, right? Because there are some kinds of foods that animals eat that we don't eat, that we can't eat. So that's not mikabel tuma. Ela im ken chishev alav, unless you had that you thought that it should be something that you can eat, and you specified that this is something that a person is going to eat. We're not going to get so much into that part of it, but it's one of the tanaim of Tumat Ochlin. So, and in any event, no food becomes tameh, could become tameh, until it is mixed with, or right, it comes into contact with one of 7 liquids. V'zeu hanikra hechsher, and that's what we mean by the term hechsher. So, in order for food to become tameh, then it has to come into contact first with some kind of liquid. Shenemar v'chiyutan mayim al zera. It's pasuk in Vayikra. You put water on a seed, and we'll look. Actually, I should have prepared that pasuk, but we'll look at that in a minute. Ve'elu hein shiva mashkin shemachshirin et ha'ochlin l'tumah. So these are the 7 liquids that are machshir ochel for tumah. Hamayim, so water. V'hatal, which is distinct in this list. That dew is also one of the 7 mashkin. V'hashemen, oil. V'hayayin, wine. V'chalav, milk. V'hadam, blood. V'hadvash, honey. V'einan machshirin ad sheyiplu al ha'ochlin b'ritzon ha'ba'alim. There's another Tanai, which is that the water had to come into contact with the food by the will of the person who owns the food. In other words, if you have fruit and somebody splashes water on it by accident, that's not considered yet to be something that's makabel tuma until the will of the person who owns the fruit recognizes or accepts that the water being on the fruit. Below yusruchin, and these liquids cannot be, let's say, contaminated or stinky. Shemashkeh saruach eino machshir, that's not machshir. V'kevan shuchshar ha'ochel, once the food becomes huchshar, af al pi shiavash, even though it dried, harehu naguv, and now it's completely dried off, hareze mikabel tuma. Okay, so these are the basic things about tumat ochlin. I think the rest of this chapter we can skip. This is the beginning of chapter 2. Kol ha'ochlin hagdilin min hakarka einam mikablin tuma ad sheyakru. So any food that grows from the ground, as opposed to, let's say, meat or cheese. But if we're talking about fruit, fruit or vegetables, anything that grows from the ground can't become tameh until they're uprooted. Right? In other words, they have to become disconnected from the ground. All the while that they're connected to the ground, even by a small root that would be enough for it to survive on, they're not mikabel tuma. And then it goes and gives examples of that.
So if you eat an apple and you wash the apple,
it's mikabel tuma. But if you were to take an apple off the tree, let's say you're tameh, and you take the apple off the tree and eat it, you weren't metameh the apple just by touching it. It's only going to be tameh if you came into contact with one of these mashkim.
Why should this be important that it's the mekabel tum'ah? Today's obviously we have no
but it's
no ash of the red cow or
the red heifer.
Yes.
Right, paraduma.
Paraduma.
Right, so nowadays it's a lo inyan. It's a lo inyan. There's no real relevance to most of the halachot of Tuman Ta'ara. Almost the only things that we really observe from Tuman Tahara still are Hilchot Nida, and as I alluded to before, Hilchot Nida, we're also the way we observe them now are really more kal than the way they would be observed for handling Taharot. They're more chumrot for Tuman Tahara, for handling actual tahar. When I say Taharot, so I mean foods that have to be tahor. So let's say truma that's given to a kohen. The kohen can only eat that if it's tahor. So the food that kohen
you can eat it, not today, but at the time of the temple, you couldn't eat the fruit when it's
when it's tameh.
When it's tameh?
Right. In fact, so truma that becomes tameh, not only are you not allowed to eat it, midioraita, it has to be burnt. You can't use it for anything. So you can imagine that Kohanim were really, really careful when they were handling food. They and their families or people that they hired, they had to handle their food in complete tahara. So it was a big deal. And as we know, people observed different levels of Tuman Tahara even after the time of the Beit HaMikdash for quite a long time. But during the time of the Mikdash especially, people had to be really careful. So these dinim are very, they were very relevant. If you look at any standard copy of the Mishnah, right, of the whole Mishnah, you'll see that the thickest part is Taharot. And I'm not sure I could check this now with the Bar Ilan thing. I don't think that there's actually more Mishnayot in Taharot, but there's an enormous amount of commentary on Taharot. It's a very complex and extensive set of halachot. But let's go on. Let's add on a little bit more to our knowledge here. I'm skipping ahead. Kol ha'ochlin shehen miba'alei chayim, right? So let's say like meat or milk or cheese, things like that. Einam mikablin tuma ad sheyamutu, right? So anything that comes from the Baal Chai, I shouldn't include milk. They're talking here about meat. So the meat from a Baal Chai, from an animal, it can't be Mekabel Tuma until the animal dies. Shachat behema chaya va'of, afa pisha dain hein mefarkasin, Mekablin Tuma. If you shechted the animal, even though they're still splaying about, right? They're still, like the chicken with it runs around with its head cut off. But once they're shechted, the meat is mikabel tuma. What about fish? Dagim emata mikabel tuma mishiamutu. From the time the fish dies, right? Since you don't have to shecht fish, but it has to be dead in order to be mikabel tuma. Gonna skip most of this.
What about milk?
Milk. Mashkin. Hold on a second.
Milk is not one of these liquids you
It is.
mentioned.
It's one of the 7 liquids.
I didn't see it. Okay.
Yeah, it's in the list. We said.
Okay.
Then we get into this question about tzitz nakuva. I don't think we have to get into that. Mashkin tamein shnaflu al ha'ochlin nitma'u afa pi shnaflu shelo beratzon abali. So the exception to what we said earlier, that liquids have to fall onto the fruit or onto the food, beratzon haba'alim, in order for the food to become mikabel tuma, with the exception if the liquids themselves were tamei. So mashkin tamein shnaflu al ochlin nitma'u, the ochlin becomes tamei afa pi shnaflu shelo beratzon haba'alim. Shaharei hatuma v'hechsher ba'in ke'achat. V'hu shelo yiyu b'karka. Right, because there, if mashkin tamein fall on food, then the contact with something that's mitameh and the contact with the hechsher, which is the liquid, come at the same time, because the liquid is both tameh and it's a machshir. Okay, I don't think we have to. And I think we're going to skip all these other things because we could spend a lot of time on this, as you can see. I'm going to skip ahead now to here. This is the most important part for our discussion. Kama shiur ochlin l'tumat atzman kol shehem. So what's the shear for food regarding tuma? So this is where we have this question of tumat, the shiur of tumat ochlim. So remember, Rebbe said that for all ochlin, for all the isurin of achila, it's kazayit, except for tumat ochlin. So now, what's the shear for ochlin for tuma? The tumat atzman kol shehem. In other words, for any piece of food to become tameh, even the smallest amount of food can become tameh. That's what he means, tumat atzman, for the tuma of the thing itself, of the food in question, even a tiny amount can become tameh. Afilu sumsum or chardal, right? So even a sesame or a mustard seed can become tameh. Shenemar kol ha'ochel. This is the pasuk that we need to keep in mind. Kol ha'ochel asher ye'achel. Any food that can be eaten, meaning kol shehu, even the smallest amount. Ve'ein ochel tamei mitamei ochel acher o mashkin o yadayim ad sheyebo kebeitza below klipata. But food that itself is tamei, right, is not mitamei other food or other drink, other liquids, or it's not mitamei one's hands, which is the other. I got sidetracked. The other dinim of taharot that we still observe today are tumat yadai, right? Because we wash our hands before we eat bread. That's a din in tumat yadai. So ochel tamei ein ochel
After netilat yadayim, the hands are no more tmeim, but we are tmeim.
even if you're tamei.
The whole body is tmeim.
Yeah, but there are different hashlachot, right? There are different ramifications for different kinds of tuma. So, for example, to take a classic example, right? So you talk about tumat mate. So, tumei mate in the time of in the time of the Midbar, when Bnei Yisrael were in the Midbar, and you had Machanei Yisrael. So you have basically three machanot, right? You have Machaneh Shechina, which is the area of the Mishkan. You have Machaneh Leviyah, which is the 2,000 amot surrounding that. And then you have Machaneh Yisrael. And then you have Michutz L'Machaneh. The Torah talks about Michutz L'Machaneh, means outside of all three. So somebody who is Tamei Meit was not allowed to go into Machaneh Shechina, but they were still allowed to go into Machaneh Leviyah. But somebody who was Tamei Tumat Sarat was Michutz L'Machaneh. So what we see is, just from that one example, there are different ramifications for different kinds of Tumah. So you can be Tamei, let's say you could be Tamei Meit, but you could still, we would still say that your hands are tamei li'inyan, let's say eating bread, and you could be metaher your hands. I should also point out tumat yadayim altogether is a tuma midrabanan. It's altogether a tuma midrabanan. Midoraita, either your whole body is tamei or your whole body is tahor. But Mishum Gzeira, there was a certain Gzeira that Chachamim made about Yadayim. And maybe we'll get to that someday, but we don't have to go into it right now. But you can be Tamei Tumat Yadayim and still you can be Mataher your Yadayim, let's say Al Yadayim Matulat Yadayim, and your body can still be otherwise tamei for other purposes. Okay, so so one of the purposes is, let's say, you're not allowed to go into Machane Shechina. This is the whole issue of going up on Har HaBayit, because if you go up on Har HaBayit, it's very possible that you'll go over the part of the Har HaBayit which is technically Machane Shechina, and then you're Chayav Karet, which is not a nice thing to do.
But if you do go to the mikveh before that, so
Zelo maspik, because you're still.
but that's what people do. No, I think so.
So the people that
I don't do it. I don't go there.
yeah, I don't do it, but there are people who are very zealous about going, and they're convinced that they know exactly where they can walk up until. They're convinced that they know the exact layout of Har HaBayit, so that wherever they're walking is the place that they're allowed to be, and they will go to the mikveh before they go up on Har HaBayit. Anyway, that's a separate discussion. But so here, let's say Kamashir L'Tuma. So L'Tumat Atzman Kol Shehein. A few Sumsum or Chardal Mitamei, they can become Tamei. Shnemar Kol Ochel Asher Yachel Kol Shu. Ve'ein Ochel Tamei Mitamei Ochel Acher O Mashkin O Yadayim. So food that itself is Tamei, it can't make other food or other drink or your hands Tamei ad shehiyabo kebetza kebelo klipata. It has to be the size of a kebetza without its shell. V'chein ha'ochel ochlim tamein. Similarly, for what other purpose do we need to know about tumat ochlim? Somebody who eats ochel tamei eino nifsal ad sheyochal kebetza umechza. What does it mean nifsal? In other words, that somebody could push, like without you touching with your hands or other parts of your body, somebody could put tamei food in your throat. And once it goes down your throat, then you've consumed it, but then that can also make you tamei. But then you have to eat ad shilchal kebetza umechza. You have to eat the size of a beitza and a half. V'zeu chatzi pras. The Rambam holds that, we talked about this when we talked about kedei achilat pras. A pras, according to the Rambam, is 3 beitzim. According to Rashi and Tosfos, it's 4 beitzim, but he says it's 3 beitzim. So it means chatzi pras. So chatzi pras is enough to be poselet hagviyah. It makes your body tamei bebeit habliyah, in your throat, once it gets to your throat. Amashkin mitamin kol shehen, umitamin bekol shehen. So any amount of mashkin can themselves become tamei, and any amount of liquid can transfer tuma. Afil tipat mashkin tameim kechardal shenaga ba'ochlin o bekelim o b'mashkim acherim nitma'u. Even a drop of water the size of a mustard seed is enough to make food or kelim, other vessels, or other liquids tamei. V'afal pichein ein hashoteh mashkin tamein nifsal ad shishteh revi'it kamo shebe'an. But in order for a person for themselves to become tamei, similar to this idea of we said a moment ago about eating, he has to drink at least a revi'it, has to go, right? He has to drink at least a revi'it in order for him to become tamei. I think that's going to be enough information for us to continue in the Gemara. So let's go back and look at our sugya. So Tanya, Rebbe Omer, Kol hashiorin kulan b'kazayit chutz mitumat ochlin. Right, all of the, hold on a second. I should get this pasuk Um, we're going to stop soon. Here. This is the source in Parshat Shmini. It's talking about different sources of Tumah. This is where we have the Shmona Shvatzim that are mitameh when they're dead. The kol kli cheres asher yipol mehem al tochol kol asher b'tochol yitma v'to tishbaru. That's it. The Shmona Shvatzim, if they're dead, if they fall into a kli cheres, they're mitameh. Mikol, then it says, Mikol ha'ochel asher ye'achel asher yavo alav mayim yitma. Any food that is eaten, that water comes on it, becomes tameh. V'chol mashke asher yishateh v'chol kli yitma. So this is Torah says explicitly that food that came into contact with water, the Shiva Mashkim we learn out, but the stam din Torah is if water falls on it. Kol mashkashi yishatem v'chol kli yitma. V'chol asher yipol minivotam alav yitma. Okay, so I come back to that, but let's leave it. Just a second. This is the pasuk of V'chiyutan mayim al zera v'nafal minivotam alav tamehu lachem. We may come back to explain these in greater depth, but let's just stick for a moment with this pasuk here, because the Gemara is going to be concerned about this pasuk to begin with. So, okay. What we want to do, our object is just to understand now what this Braita means. The Braita says all of the shiurim for eating, as Rashi explains, Hamurim Ba'ochlin, they're all kazayit. Right? Anything that's to do with achila from the Torah is measured by a kazayit, except for tumat ochlin. That's the exception. And why is it the exception? Sheshina hakatuv b'mashma'an, because the Torah changed its meaning. V'shinu chachamim b'shiuran. And so the chachamim changed their shiur. The Rayam Davar, and a proof for this is from Yom HaKippurim. Okay, since everybody's getting tired, not just you, Michael Warner, don't worry, I see everybody else is getting tired. What I'm going to do, I'm going to read the next part to give you a basic reading. And then next week, we're going to try to understand this in greater depth. But this is now where the Gemara is going to go into more of the issues about shiurim, certain conceptual issues that have to do with shiurim are now going to be discussed. So this is what Rebbe says. And why? Rashi says here, it's that this part of the Braita is yet to be explained. It's going to be explained later on. The Shinu Chachamim b'Shiuran, and the proof is from Yom Kippurim. So the Gemara asks, "My Shina hakatuv b'mashma'o." What does it mean that the Torah that the Torah changed its meaning or its implication. Mi lo tu'uneh. What does it mean that the Chachamim changed its shiur? Kikotevet. So, what the Gemara is saying here is, when Rebbe says, we'll lay it out this way. He starts off with this basic din that the shiur for ochlin in the Torah for all halachic purposes is going to be measured as a kazayit, except for tumat ochlin. So now the question is going to be, why is tumat ochlin different? Why don't I include the din of tumat ochlin with the same shiur as the rest of ochlin in the Torah? Why don't I just say that it's all pikazayit? What's the difference about tumat ochlin? So he says, because the Torah changed their meaning or changed their implication, and because the Torah changed their implication, the Chachamim changed their shiur. In other words, the Chachamim saw that the Torah itself is indicating that there's a different shiur here. The Rayal Davar Yoma Kippurim, and the proof for this is from Yom Kippur. So what does it mean? Because this is based on certain concepts we've already discussed. Why don't we say that eating a kazayit of food on Yom Kippur is enough to be chayav chatat? Why do we say that you have to eat a kotevet hagasa in order to be chayav chatat? Because to begin with, we didn't learn it. Michael Schwartz, what did you want to say?
Well, we just learned that it's yeshuva dat is enough to give you yeshuva dat.
Okay, so we learned that the shiur is going to be based on this idea of yeshuva dat, but in a more fundamental way, this is a concept we discussed earlier in our shiurim. The Torah never says that you're not allowed to eat on Yom Kippur. What does it say?
You have to note yourself. You have to afflict yourself.
You have to afflict yourself. So you see, that's a case of Shina Katuv b'mashma'an. The Torah, when it's we understand, Chazal understand that the Torah is telling me you're not allowed to eat on Yom Kippur, but it doesn't say you're not allowed to eat. It says Kol hanefesh asher lo tu'uneh b'yom hazeh, right? Is your chayav karet. So the Torah is Shina HaKatuv. The Torah changed the implication of this Isur by using a different Lashon. And
But
so
it's not the Torah which changed it, it's the Chachamim changed it. I don't understand.
No,
They interpreted it this way. That's their interpretation.
Okay, but from Chazal's point of view, it goes like this. That that Chazal understand what you're saying is not wrong. But what the Gemara is looking at is like this. Chazal understand that one is not allowed to eat on Yom Kippur, but the way the Torah told us that you're not allowed to eat on Yom Kippur was not by using a lashon achila. It didn't use a term of achila. It's used this term of inui nefesh. So that implies to me that now it's going to change something about the nature of the halacha of eating. And one of the implications is going to be that the shiur for eating is going to be different than the shiur for eating where the Torah says explicitly achila. So we have a category of halachot, like you're not allowed to eat chametz on Pesach, and it says ki kol ochel machmetzet, kol ochel machmetzet is chayav, right? So there the Torah used lashon achila. So here, where the Torah used a different lashon to imply achila, it's also
Imply
telling.
achila according to Chazal.
Yes, but who else? That's how we know how anything means, what anything means. That's an important concept which I'll talk about in a second. I just want to finish this thought. So what the Gemara is saying, the Gemara is just trying to understand now the words of Rebbe and the Breita, and it's saying we derive we have a basis for saying that when the Torah changes the language of Achilah, that it implies that implied to Chazal that they should change the shiur. So most ochlin is asur be'kazait, but when it came to Yom, and we'll bring a proof from Yom Kippur, because here the Torah changed the way it talks about Achilah and Yom Kippur by talking about it in terms of Inui. And so that implied to Chazal that it had a different shiur. Now, I'm going to leave this part of the sugya for now, and we're going to go over it again. We'll look at Rashi, and we're hopefully going to go on in the Gemara. But just to address what Paul was bringing up, I'll just say something generally about Kabbalat Chazal, which I think is an important thing. So you might know there's a story in the Gemara and Shabbos about this non-Jew who came to Hillel to convert, and he said, "I'll convert al menat that I'll accept Torah shebichtav and not Torah sheba'al peh." So he accepts him. He says, "Fine." He says, "But you have to come and learn with me." So he comes first day to learn, and he teaches him Aleph Bet. He points to an Aleph. He says Aleph, points to a Bet, says Bet, etc. Goes through the whole Aleph. Then he comes the next day and he tells the guy to, tell him the letters, and he starts to say Aleph, Aleph, and Bet, Bet. He says, no, maybe the Aleph is a Bet, and maybe the Gimel is a Dalet, and maybe the Tet is a Shin. He says, no, but yesterday you told me Aleph is Aleph and Bet is Bet. So he says, the same way that I taught you Aleph Bet, that's how we learn the entire Torah. And it's actually a really fundamental lesson that you get from the story. And I say that it's something I emphasize when I talk about writing Sifrei Torah. A Sefer Torah is not self-explanatory in any way. When I look at the only thing I have in the Sefer Torah are the letters of the Torah. How do I know how to read those letters? I know that because there's an oral tradition that tells me how to read the letters. If I didn't have an oral tradition, I wouldn't know how to read it. And I think this maybe came up, I don't remember if this is in this class or not, but there are languages that no one knows how to read, right? They're dead languages where we see writing and no one knows how to read them. We don't know how to decipher them. We certainly don't know how to pronounce any of the words because the oral tradition died out. It literally died out. So from Chazal's point of view, their Kabbalah, right? Their Kabbalah is essential for any understanding of the Torah. Now, we could get into a long discussion about that, and we could argue about this or that or the other thing, but there's certain things that I think you can't argue about. So you could say, when it comes to this question of Achilah and Yom Kippur, the Torah doesn't say you're not allowed to eat, but it says that you have to be ma'aneh nefesh. So what does that mean? What do the words mean? So that's, of course, that's the next level up from reading the words. Okay, so I have a Kabbalat Chazal about how to read the words, but what do they mean? So we rely on Kabbalat Chazal to say that this is what they mean. That's maybe an oversimplified version of the nature of Torah Shebaal Peh, but it's a basic concept. So
This is an
yeah,
interpretation of the interpretation. You can say when you do a perush, you can say, well, I take this text and I give it that perush. But you could say, no, the text is already, that's beforehand already the significance of the text. Not that
in other words,
זה לא שאני מטיל את הפירוש שלי על הטקסט, אלא שהטקסט בעצמו, יש לו כבר, זה פירושו בפשט.
זה משתמע מתוך הטקסט עצמו. Right? So, but so this is the what we're talking about here. This is the element of the way Chazal understood Torah Shebaal Peh, that there's certain things that Chazal had as a Kabbalah, which for them were defining, right? They were mamash kovea. There's a very interesting discussion in the Ibn Ezra. You can look for yourself in the beginning of Parshat Vayakel on the pasuk of Lo tavaru esh b'chol shviltechem b'yom haShabbat. So he recounts there a discussion / really a polemic that he had with a Kara'i, with the Karaite. So the Kara'im would put out all of their fires before Shabbat. And it's based on that pasuk. Lo tavaresh b'yom Shabbat. You can't have any fire. That's how they understood it. Chazal, of course, understood it differently, and it just meant that you can't light a fire, but you could have a fire burning. So Ibn Ezra challenges him, says, even according to you, like you want to take the Torah in a literal fashion. So you want to ki'ilu not relate to this Torah Shebaal Peh Chazal, but even according to you, so you should be able to have fires burning on Leil Shabbat. Because when it says Lo tavaresh b'makom shviltechem b'yom Shabbat. What about Laila? Laila you could have. So the Kara'i says to him, he says, no, but the Torah says, Vayher vayiboker yom echad. So yom includes both night and day. And then Ibn Ezra counters, he says, but when the Torah talks about the Korban Tamid, right? It says that the keves achad taseh baboker, but the keves hashini taseh ben ha'arbaim, and it says that you bring the Korban Tamid bayom. So from there, I would say that yom is only the daylight hours, and they go back and forth. You can bring different proofs from different places, and it's worth going through the whole discussion. But from the Ibn Ezra's point of view, and which is Chazal's point of view, is that there's certain things that you had to rely on Chazal for, because you can't be machriya yourself from the psukim. So you can come and you can interpret it all you want, but there's certain things that you had to rely on Chazal for. This is, by the way, a very interesting aspect of the Ibn Ezra, the way he related to Chazal. Because many of his perushim on the Torah are not the same as Chazal, but when it came to anything halachic, even when he wanted to, even if he offered a different interpretation, but he made it clear that he bowed to Chazal in terms of halacha, and he respected that that's the proper interpretation for halachic purposes. But anyway, this is all bit of a digression, but you ask a good question, so I try to give you at least a minimal answer in my Lefi Aniyut Da'ati. Tov, so let's stop here, and Bezrat Hashem, we'll meet next week. We'll meet next year.
Next year for you.
Next year. Right. For Jews, it's still the same year, but for the Goyim, I long to be back in Israel. I long
Actually, although I'd say the idea of a new year doesn't sound entirely bad right now.
Yeah.
You don't have a Christmas tree?
You know, one of my Jewish friends who's secular asked this, put on her Facebook page. She was just out of curiosity. She said, all my Jewish friends, tell me if you had a Christmas tree when you were growing up. And there's a very wide range of answers. It's really interesting.
Actually, we did occasionally when I was growing up.
See, so
There's there are two ways to rationalize this. The
Only
first is
two?
that it's actually not a Christian symbol, but a pagan symbol.
Yeah, that makes it better. It's a Vodazara.
That's the Vodazara, there you go. The second is sort of Alan Dershowitz's, I'm not a great fan of Alan Dershowitz, but he is clever sometimes. He has what he calls his pink flamingo rule, which is that if it would not be out of place on next to a pink flamingo lawn ornament, it's not religious.
Oh, I'm not sure if you know what a pink flamingo is in this context. Michael Werner, why don't you explain?
Oh, pink flamingo, it's a very American thing. It's based like a very cheesy kind of lawn ornament.
A lawn ornament. It's like it's a bird. It's a plastic bird, or I think it's plastic that you stick in the ground, and people put it in their garden just to make it look like a bird is there. Everybody knows that it's not a real bird, but it's just like, as Michael said, it's a cheesy American thing. Anyway,
it's actually, so it's basically like one step cheesier than garden gnomes.
I was going to say,
Yes.
you probably know about garden gnomes, the little men. Anyway, this is too much of a digression. I'm going to leave it here.
Yes, and as Jews, we're not antinomian.
And it's what?
And as Jews, we're not antinomian.
Ooh. Okay. As halachically observant anyway.
Yes,
Okay. Until next week.
יישר כוח.
Shabbat
Shabbat shalom.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night.